After lunch, Natia lay on the sharp eye, pressed between Amma and the wall. Abu lay on the other bed, Mateen and Isha sprawled across him. It was late in the afternoon, and the house was locked up so the Sahib and Baji could nap. Shirzad slept in his room by the gate, his mother long gone after collecting his wages and food to return home with. Abu's voice, a steady, deep murmur that sounded like soft drums, rose and fell as he told stories about the men he met on the site, the building they were constructing, and the petty antics of laborers who plagued the project. His beard had grown long and was singed with gray. Deep grooves etched downward from both sides of his wide nose to the corners of his mouth. His lips were darker than before and cracked from the constant exposure to the sun. His shoulders were still wide enough for Isha and Mateen to rest their heads, but his frame somehow seemed smaller. Natia lay on her side, leaning against her mother's ample back, the ropes of the sharpai digging into her elbow as she listened, half sleeping, to the melody of her father's voice. Abu patted his left thigh with a heavy hand. My leg cries every time I walk the boundary, 5 times a day, after every azan. The call to prayer is the unrelenting alarm clock that forces me to walk all 4 corners of the Sahib's massive construction site. He shook his head. Chowkidar, they said. A chowkidar sits at the gate and lets the public in or keeps them out. A man with a bad leg should sit at the gate, not walk the boundary 5 times a day, Abu muttered under his breath. He caught Natia's gaze and said, Tomorrow I will stay home with you. Tell the Sahib in the morning that I am ill. Natia glanced down at her mother's closed eyes, then looked back at her father and nodded. He could rest for a few days, and with Shirzad's ordeal behind them, it was likely that the Mem Sahib would let it slide. Good girl. Natia cherished the warmth of Abu's smile. The following day, a grumbling Sahib drove away while Abu slept past noon. Natia cleaned the house alone, allowing her mother time to rest with Abu. Since it was common for Masis to miss work without calling, as most had no access to telephones, Natia took advantage of this fact and skipped the other houses. One day won't get me fired, she thought. She supplemented the Baji's sparse meal by digging out a few saved rupees to buy kebab rolls from the defense market. The pleasure on Abu's face as he bit into the spicy meat and licked the dripping grease from his wrist made Natia full. She had even had spare notes to buy one for Shirzad, who accepted the treat with barely a nod. Abu stayed in their quarters for most of the day, except only when nature called, and even then he was careful to limp in case the Baji was watching. As she did every afternoon, Seema locked herself inside the house so she could take her afternoon nap without fear of intruders. Natia was exhausted from doing all the cleaning and running to the market. Amma, Mateen, and Isha were already asleep, so she decided to lie down on the remaining sharpai. Although the slant of the sun had proved that time had passed, it seemed as if only a few moments had gone by when the air was filled with Seema's shrill cries and her father's deep voice. Natia awoke with a start, confused and groggy. What happened? Amma asked, suddenly alert. Abu's voice boomed from the front of the house, forcing Amma to sit up quickly. Ya Allah, she muttered. What has that man done now? She swung her legs off the bed and sat up slowly. She winced and stood by degrees, the weight of her own body almost too much for her feet to bear. She walked barefoot with heavy steps to the door and pushed it open with her hip. Natia squinted as she watched her mother waddle along to the front of the house. Isha and Mateen were still asleep. She wanted to go back to sleep and let Amma tell her what had happened when she returned. But when Amma disappeared around the corner, the voices grew louder. Natia's skin prickled despite the heat. What could have happened? When the air became charged with Amma's voice, high-pitched and pleading, Natia stumbled out of the quarters, her curiosity transformed into a cold fear that spread across the back of her neck. She ran around the house, down the sloping driveway, and outside the open gate. A peddler with his two-wheeled cart was parked under the shade of the neem tree. Abu stood beside the cart, looking both belligerent and sheepish. The peddler and Amma were speaking over each other, vying for the Baji's attention. When Seema spotted Natia, she snapped her fingers at her and called out sharply, Go get Shirzad! Natia ducked back into the driveway and rapped on the door to the gatekeeper's quarters. Shirzad! Wake up, Shirzad! Natia noticed that the door was slightly ajar, so she opened it further, pushing aside the mosquito netting to meet the boy's steady gaze. Baji wants you! Shirzad rose calmly and came out into the street where Seema ordered him to relieve the peddler's cart of his wares. The peddler protested and pressed his palms together. Baji, I bought these goods and have already paid your chowkidar. He nodded at Abu. You can take back the goods only if he gives me the money back. He never gave me any money, Abu shouted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I had only loaded the materials on the cart, and you came out before he paid me. Check his pockets, Baji. The peddler wrung his hands together, twisting his fingers, locking and interlocking them. You and your chowkidar are trying to rob a poor man who makes an honest living. You can't take back the merchandise and keep the money. How will I survive? Natsia looked at the cart more closely and recognized machinery, spare parts, and scrap metal, all the Sahib's property that had been stored for so long in the back room adjacent to theirs. Abu was stealing! Natsia tasted metal and clenched her jaw to hold down the bile. Abu must have quietly collected the items to sell to the scrap dealer while they all slept. Seema had probably heard or seen him carrying the materials to the gate. How else would she have known he was out here? How could he do this to them? Natsia was dizzy with grief. Grief for herself, for her siblings, and for her mother. But most of all, grief over the knowledge that Amma was right about Abu. Natsia, don't just stand there. Help Shirzad move everything inside. Seema began lifting pieces of scrap metal off the cart and placing them in the driveway. She paused in front of Natsia's mother and said, Get the money out of your husband's pockets, or you can leave with him right now. She brushed past Natsia and continued to carry the Sahib's scraps back through the gate. Amma berated Abu and scuffled with him until she managed to pry the money from his kurta. Natsia's cheeks grew hot as she noticed the neighboring servants and chowkidars coming out to watch the spectacle. Within minutes, the machinery and metal parts were whisked back to the storage room and the scrap collector's money was returned. Seema snapped her fingers at Shirzad. Go and get the other children. She turned back to Amma. You can come and get your things when you've found someplace else to stay. Amma's eyes widened. But Baji, where will we go? She grasped her arm. Please, don't punish us all for my stupid husband's mistake. Seema shook herself free. He is useless now. How can we trust him? God knows what he's been doing at the Sahib's site. Instead of guarding, he's probably been selling off the Sahib's supplies and equipment, then blaming it on the laborers. I stole nothing, I swear to you. Abu hung his head, but there was no conviction in his voice. Don't you speak to me, Seema said, her voice grim. You get away from here and don't come back. Take your wretched family with you. She turned to Amma. You've all been nothing but trouble since the moment you arrived. Take your children and get out. I have Shirzad. I don't need the rest of you. Baji, please. Amma whispered, her hands clasped together. We have nowhere else to go. Seema turned her gaze towards Shirzad, who stood at the gate. Are you deaf? Go and get the children. Shirzad edged around the back of the house. Amma suddenly collapsed at Seema's feet. She clutched Seema's ankles through her thin shalwar and looked up, her eyes pleading. Baji, I will send Salim away. When he finds work, he will call for us. Let us stay until then. Natsia tried to lift her mother up by the arm. Amma, what are you doing? Get up. Her mother's flesh was hot as she twisted out of Natsia's grasp. Amma, you don't have to do this. We can find another place. She gritted her teeth together to keep from shouting. We don't have to beg. Stop begging. When Amma looked at her, Natsia recoiled at the desperation that glassed over her mother's eyes. The truth was painfully apparent. There really was no place else to go. Behind her, Isha and Mateen whined as Shirzad led them through the gate and onto the street. Abu was standing off to the side now, almost melting into the gathering crowd. Was he already washing his hands of them? It dawned on Natsia that Abu would not stop Amma from begging, nor would he beg in her place. He was going to take care of only himself, the way he always did. She felt as though a thick black blanket were descending over her, smothering her in heavy darkness. Why hadn't she seen it before? She glanced around slowly until the crowd came into focus. There was no savior. No uncle, brother, or father would come and rescue them. They were all strangers. It was up to her and Amma to salvage what they could from Abu's dreadful mistake. She turned away from Abu and the rest of the onlookers and wiped her eyes until Seema was no longer a blurry vision of sweltering rage. Baji, Natsia lifted her chin. What Abu did was wrong. We have served you well, haven't we? Let us stay. I promise we will not betray you. Seema stepped back and tried to extract her leg from Amma's grip. I won't listen to you, Natsia. Not this time. With all the will she could muster, Natsia took a firm grip of Seema's wrist. Yes, Baji, listen. Seema pulled her wrist away and balked. And why should I? Natsia bent down and slowly pulled Amma from Seema's feet. We have no place to go, and because I am not my father, I am not a thief. Seema sighed audibly. The crowd of onlookers on the street had grown, and they pressed forward, eager to hear the drama unfold. What are you all looking at? Go back to work. Seema waved her hands at them as though shooing gulls from a picnic on the beach. Vultures feeding off the misery of each other. That's what you all are. Get away from my house. She shoved a boy standing nearby, and slowly the crowd began to disperse, snickering as they left. Abu took a few more steps back when Seema gave him a withering look. Do you hear, Natsia? Seema shouted scornfully. You do not deserve a daughter with such dignity. You allowed your wife and daughter to beg on your behalf. What a pity you are. At least one good thing has come of this. Abu stepped forward eagerly, as though forgiveness were a possibility. The Baji held up her hand. Not one more step. At least now your family knows your true colors. She turned to Natsia. I don't know why I should listen to you, Natsia, but you can stay. If I ever see your father around here again, I will have him skinned alive. Thank you, Baji. Abu will leave immediately.